if this guy went out and raced his bike and did this and his brakes were ejected and he crashed and got hurt, injured, or died, like, that's on us. And he just left it there. And I was just like, oh. And it scared me, quite honestly. And what I think it brought me back to was having this, I need to know everything I do is to the highest quality that it can be done.
Welcome to the Talking Shop podcast, where I'm here to share stories, lessons, and experiences in sports performance and professional development. Today, I'm joined by Dr. John Abbott with the Chicago Cubs. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Matt. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm doing well. Always a good day when I can record a podcast and catch up with friends. And what is your technical title before we get going?
So this year I took on a slightly different role of minor league strength and conditioning coach as well as sport performance scientist.
Nice. So I definitely didn't want to mess that up because I know that nowadays there's so many different titles and like everything's the same thing, but it's called different. So minor league S&C and performance scientist. So how Dr. John and I know each other, it's kind of an interesting story, but I think I just tweeted out about us getting the Nordboard where I coach. And I was like, hey, I'm totally a noob, would love to just learn from whoever about it. I think you liked the tweet, and then I sent you a DM, and I was like, "So this means you have one?" And you were like, "Yeah." I was like, "You want to teach me about it?" And you were like, "Yeah." And then we chatted for I don't know how long, but super nice guy. It was actually very helpful, and it just shows like how kind of powerful just like being professional, putting yourself out there on Twitter and social media is. But then also nice people like kind of like pulling you. You have to push yourself out there. People have to pull you in. But that's actually how I also met Corey, who's your boss.
Mm-hmm.
I made a little experiment just on my own self on the 1080 sprint, and then I like tweeted it out there, and then he like responded and just asked me a question, and then I was like, hey, you want to hop on the phone? And so it's crazy how simple it can be, I guess. But I really enjoyed our chat, and I enjoyed kind of hearing your background, how you got to the Cubs and kind of all that stuff. So for those who are not familiar, can you kind of take us through your background?
Absolutely. Actually, just go on one thing you said, how simple it is to reach out and interact on Twitter. I think it's also interesting how many people overcomplicate it. And Corey and I had a pretty good kind of learning moment where I may have not engaged in conversation as kindly as possible over Twitter and sat down and kind of re-talked about how you do that. And it's just like what you said, professional, easy, ask a question and be very professional about it. So I really appreciated that connection as well. But about me, I'm born and raised in South Jersey, right outside Atlantic City. I was a diver all through high school, went to state championships, did pretty well. Went to Westchester University initially to dive. That was the main reason to go there. And I studied exercise science with a specialty in strength and conditioning, I believe it was. After that, I did my master's also at Westchester University. I worked a little bit with Ken Clark. And also during my time there, I worked at Haverford College teaching a course that was pretty much all things exercise science with Corey Waltz, who's now the director of UPenn strength conditioning. I coached a high school diving team, and then I also worked at a bike shop as a service tech, but also an exercise physiologist and coach. After that, I had a year off where I worked at two different private sector facilities. One was geared towards high school students, where I worked with two football teams, lacrosse, and then a whole hodgepodge of different athletes. But then after that, I went to High Performance Athletic Training Center in Westchester in Pennsylvania, worked with the Philadelphia Junior Flyers developmental program, and I was the head for our juniors team, which was a super exciting time. I was only with them for one season and had an interesting bring on to that, but we ended up winning the championship that year for the league, which was really exciting. And then after that year off, I always had wanted to go back for a PhD. So I went to ETSU and I did my doctorate and studied under Dr. Stone, Meg Stone, Dr. DeWeese, Kim Misato, and I worked really closely with John Waggle, Sauceman, Alex Wetmore, bunch of different, great coaches, great friends. And while at ETSU, I was kind of like the metabolic guy. So any sort of metabolic testing that happened was I led. So therefore, I also coached our triathlon, women's cross country teams, and I worked with most of our OTS track athletes in the beginning. We had a couple of endurance athletes that Dr. Deweese had brought in that I was assisting with. And then towards the end of that, I stepped into what was kind of John Waggle's role with Alex Wetmore. We co-supervised the weight room overseeing all Olympic sports besides besides basketball at ETSU. And I directly assisted Dr. Deweese with all of our Olympic training site athletes. So bobsled, skeleton, kayak, canoe, track and field, and then any of his other professional athletes like football, or if he had one MLB guy come in as well. After that, I had a small stint at UPenn with Corey Waltz, so went back there to try to do an internship. And then within a 3-week period, I was called by Corey and offered this job out here. And within another week, I moved out here and started spring training.
When it happens, it definitely happens fast. And what I enjoyed kind of when you were first telling the story, well, first there's correlation isn't causation, but you joined the junior Flyers and then they won the championship. So that's all I'm saying. But what I enjoyed kind of when we first chatted, it's funny, we chatted maybe like half our call about the Nordboard and then half the call just about everything else. But was kind of the end-ish. So basically ETSU for now, or until now. So I want to chat on kind of your time there. Because I know that you mentioned that you brought on a lot of teams and it was just like you were a PhD student, but then like you're basically full time with all of these kind of teams and stuff. And then kind of the whole internships to the Cubs thing, because I thought that was pretty interesting. But so you were doing your dissertation and that was on metabolic stuff with cyclists, correct?
It was cycling related. We didn't have too many cyclists, so we did repeat sprintability. It was a repeat sprintability study where we looked at the difference between strong and weak individuals as determined by a symmetric mid-thigh. And we looked at differences in their repeat sprintability as told by the bike, but also differences in bilateral muscle oxygenation and the kinetics with that, so usage and recovery. But then we also looked at heart rate and metabolic heart measures as well.
Very fancy, very fancy. The metabolic guy for sure. And then kind of, could you chat about what it was like trying to balance not only doing your PhD while you were there, but also having all of those teams? Because I know that you mentioned that it kind of got to be a decent amount of work. So kind of just that whole experience.
It's easily probably some of the biggest learning experiences I've gone through. And it is impossible. It wasn't just me. I have to say, like, Dr. Deweese does a great job at teaching you and guiding you through his methods of how to handle that and how to become a leader in the field. And then being able to rely on the team that surrounds you. So at the time it was Alex Wetmore, and then Thomas Mislinski, Joe D'Amato, Kayla Hairholzer, that we were a solid crew. But it's kind of a slow ramp up. So like every student starts off with a team, and as you go through, you eventually get offered more and more. You're able to take on more responsibilities or offered more responsibilities. And so it kind of sneaks up on you sometimes that, you don't really realize what was happening. But as for like trying to manage it, it became very pertinent. And it's kind of a theme of some of the other stuff I want to talk about, is kind of having a really solid plan, doing the plan, and reviewing after, see like how that went well. And that's something I stole from Adam Beard, our current high performance director, who's trying to really instill this plan, do a review. But beginning of each day was kind of a wake up, have coffee, which are early mornings. And then I'd even plan when I would go get my coffee, only not because I needed the caffeine, but I knew I would need it to step out of the dome at ETSU to breathe for a second. It was a nice little 3-minute walk to go get coffee and come back. So I think one of the biggest things that made that possible was being able to kind of set a schedule for myself early in the morning and have goals throughout the day, which were very diverse, which it could have been from coaching 90-yard ROTC athletes in the morning, where you have to be incredibly hyped up and screamo rock music's on just because that's their culture, and really getting them moving well. But then also teaching and coaching the importance of some of our lifts and make sure that we're doing it properly. And but then having 3 minutes to shift and then work with women's volleyball, which is a much more quiet team at that time. I think they were coming in at 6:30, so ROTC was in there at 5:30. So being able to go to 100, back down to 60, back up to 100, then go sit in the class after you've been screaming and listen to Doc. And usually that was like right after lunch. And if you ever listen to him talk, he's just got such a monotone voice, and it's perfect for putting you to sleep. But you know you can't. So it's so much there that it really came down to like just setting a good routine and having kind of goals and expectations for yourself every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every hour, every 3 hours, and then just make sure you change that up every day to ensure that you do well every day.
And then there was one quote that we'll touch on briefly, not to turn this into a training podcast, but one thing I enjoyed kind of on our first chat was like everything that you do within your training, you should have a plan or an expectation of what's going to happen. So this idea of like stimulus response, well, you should like have a pretty accurate guess of kind of what it should be. So if you could succinctly in like 3 bullet points or kind of just elaborate a little bit more on kind of just that phrase, if you remember what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I do, exactly. And I can't remember the quote I used precisely before, but there was a small story, which is one that I'll touch on earlier, which is as a mechanic, and I'm completely avoiding your 3 points, but I was a service tech working at a bike shop, and long story short, I was putting a bike back together. I put the brakes on backwards, and it's pretty pertinent that they couldn't go that way because of safety screws, and if you hit the brakes, it would launch the brake pads out of the holders, and you'd have no brakes. And my manager came over to me and said, like, hey, like, what's this? I was like, oh, I did this, did that, worked on this. Great. He goes, this is really dangerous. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, what happens when we squeeze the brake? And I kind of chuckled at first. I'm like, oh God, that's not good. And then he's like, no, like, this is a fireable offense. Like, if this guy went out and raced his bike and did this and his brakes were ejected and he crashed and got hurt, injured, or died, like, that's on us. And he just left it there. And I was just like, oh. And it scared me, quite honestly. And what I think it brought me back to was having this, I need to know everything I do is to the highest quality that it can be done. I need to ensure that I've done everything I can to make sure it's up to a gold standard. And I'm going to double check everything. And if I'm not positive, I'm going to ask people, I'm going to call people. I couldn't tell you how many times I called bike shops or companies to be like, hey, like, I'm looking at this. I went through this. I'm not exactly sure, like, is this right? And if I got like a green light or a list of green lights, good to go. And that's what really fueled my quest of education for strength and conditioning, was I didn't feel that I could do that with a lot of different aspects of my programming. I knew that there were concepts that were good, but not as clearly I feel confident that this will do this, and I'm going to do that. There's a lot of times where I'm like, I've seen this, I hear people talk about it, but it just seems like a lot of smoke and mirrors sometimes, and I'm not really sure yet. And that was something that working at ETSU, studying so intensively and working under DeWeese and Stone and all of them, that they had purpose-driven programming that was evidence-backed, and they followed up and they measured themselves afterwards and made sure it happened, which I think is really important as well.
Makes sense that kind of philosophy, I guess, led you to ETSU, and as I'm accumulating more guests from that ETSU tree, that it's just that pursuit of more knowledge and just like wanting to know for sure, has definitely been a similar theme. Everyone's kind of own context and lens, and no one has had a bike brake mishap lead them to ETSU, but interesting kind of just elaborating on that. So I thought that quote kind of just stuck out to me from our call. But last kind of thing before we get into the main questions. So when you were kind of going through your story the first time, you said that you got your PhD and everything, and then you're like, oh yeah, and then I did an internship, and I was like, isn't like the PhD, like, isn't that how you like get a super killer job plus all the previous experience you had? And of course, your internship was very short lived. But if you could kind of chat on kind of just the circumstances and then kind of just that whole part.
Yeah, it's a really cool experience, and I felt bad having to leave. So I'd mentioned earlier that I worked at Haverford teaching this course to their undergrads, and that was led by Corey Watts, who at the time was I forget his exact role, but he was their head strength conditioning coach. But it's a smaller school, and so we made a really good connection. I worked with him for, I guess, a year and a half teaching that course. And then we just kind of always stayed in contact with her. I'd recommended someone to follow me, and I was coming towards the end of my PhD, which was at that 2.5-year mark of the 3-year process, and I didn't have any more courses to take, and I was ready to try to figure out what was the next step to help me get to the next step. And the one thing that I think my journey kind of lacked a little bit was networking and getting a little bit more hands-on experience in other collegiate settings. And so I reached out to Corey, and we talked for a while, and he was trying to do some more sports science stuff. He had just taken the role just that beginning of that year as director of strength and conditioning at UPenn. Jeremy Weeks is his assistant. They're both really interested in sports science and figuring out how they could use stuff they had. They had Sparta plates, they had timing guides, they had jump mats, they had some VBT stuff, and they have, I think they said, like 900 athletes. It was a massive athletic population, and I think they had 6 or 7 coaches. And so amongst all that talking, one of the things that came was like I could really kind of step in and help them with this concept of managing sports science and data, and then I could also gain a lot of experience, acting as a coach and then seeing a different collegiate setting that has, a massive amount of athletes and how that runs. And I was really curious to gain more insight on the administrative side of directing rather than strength and conditioning, which was a big interest of mine. And it went off really great. We got in and we set up some systems right away within like the first 4 or 5 days of like, hey, these are things we had, this is what we want to do, this is a plan of how we can start to use them. And it was incredible to see a different culture and learn how to take everything I've learned, which at ETSU, it's very easy to talk about sports science because everyone's on the same wavelength, the same language, the same concept. So you could say 2 words and everyone knows what you mean. But if you go anywhere else, the whole problem with jargon is, things get lost. And so it was really interesting over those couple of days to get into maybe some heated discussions and all goodness. And I'm still really good friends with Corey and Jeremy, but it was really interesting to go through all that, and then have to go through. I think I got a text from Brad, from Dr. DeWeese, and said, "Hey, do you want to work with the Cubs?" I was like, "What?" Call this guy. Call Corey, and then I started that process, and I went through that. And it was really hard then to have to learn how to come back to Corey and break the news to him. Like, hey, we set up all these really cool things, and you're not super proficient in some of them, and I can help you from afar for a while, but I think I got to do this. Like, it's not every day you get this call. And he was understanding, and it was a little hard, but we still had routine calls from there on. So overall, I was there for, I think, about 5 days before I got that first text from Brad, and I moved in and out of Philly within 2.5 weeks. Yeah.
Very quick turnaround. Definitely when it rains, it pours.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I signed my full-time contract that it's more of an agreement, but I think that was on a Wednesday, and the next Monday I got a text. It was like, "Yo, high school in Michigan, like, you interested?" I'm like, "Oh my gosh," whatever. But I'm very happy where I am now. But it was just kind of funny, just going through this whole like job search journey that I talk about way too much on my podcast. 18 months, and then I decided to like hunker down, and then like 4 days or however many days later, it's like, oh my gosh, whatever. I'm not salty or anything, but so so it was Corey knew Brad, and then Brad recommended you.
I believe so, yeah. And the other interesting thing too, as well, is Austin Smith is now here as well. So he was hired before I was, and he was also an ETSU grad. So like there's that connection, and Shane Wall, and our head strength conditioning coach, interned with Josh Kristovich at the Browns, which is where him and Adam, I believe, had met. But then Kristovich was also an ETSU a grad. So like we didn't know each other directly, but there was a link between a lot of people here and a lot of people at ETSU. And talking to them on the phone, it was quickly understandable to be a good fit, and we have a really similar mindset as a whole.
Yeah, one thing I definitely believe, and this is kind of from Corey, and his story was like he met Adam Beard like 4 years ago, 5 years ago at
Yeah,
like a conference, and they just like kind of stayed in touch. And then Adam came to the Cubs and was like, "Hey, you're coming with me," you know?
yeah,
So
yeah,
like one thing I totally believe is like there's jobs that are filled before they're even like officially things, you know?
yeah, oh yeah, oh
Like
yeah,
like your role probably wasn't even posted, you know? Like
yeah,
they probably determined that there was a need and they started texting people, and like that's kind of how it goes. So not to like retell his story, but I just think it's super interesting, kind of like, and it's funny. I was networking with this guy from Louisville, and then I was just telling him about myself and everything. I was like, yeah, cold applications, like it's not really a thing. He goes, oh, that's how I got my first job. I'm like, literally like the one time I
yeah,
say that, whatever, but a majority
yeah,
of jobs are filled before, it's even a thing,
yeah,
or another thing I say is like the applicant pool is at least already set, because if everyone on that staff, there's 5 people, they each recommend 2 people, or they
mhm,
each contact 2 people, which there's your
yeah,
10 applicants right there. So there's so much value in just being a good person, working hard for the right people, and just like being good at what you do, and kind of just when it rains, it pours, and you never know when that's going to happen. But if you have this perfectly curated umbrella from ETSU, you can handle when it pours. And look at me putting that all together.
yeah.
Um, so that's a little bit about where you've been and where you are. So we'll get into it. What is the coolest
Perfect.
story thus far you have in your career?
Yeah, so I have 3 points to talk about. Two are being really quick, and then one's going to be a cool, interesting story. As I mentioned earlier, I worked and interned at a bike shop in Philadelphia, which is one of the probably most renowned shops. We had a full physiology lab, metabolic cart. We did VO2 max testing, lactate threshold testing, metabolic efficiency, pedal efficiency. We did all sorts of all things, and it was an exciting day because one, I was in an internship. Two, it was the first time I was allowed to run the test on my own. The head guy didn't want to watch because it happened to be the day of the Manioc bike race, which is the same race that Lance Armstrong won his first national championship at many years before. So it's a really, really big deal, and pros from all over the world fly in for it. And my boss, he in the morning goes, "Hey, we have this girl, this lady's going to come in. She interned with us before. She wants a VO2 max test. Should be pretty easy. She kind of knows the deal. Like if you could walk her through it, that'd be great." I was like, "All right, cool." I didn't think much about it, and so I get her in, and I kind of had this my own process of trying to read the athlete to figure out who I was working with and how I needed to coach them through this VO2 max test, because it's an intensive test that can quickly become overwhelming. Or people just don't know how to push themselves too hard. It's a weird balance with that. But so I was talking to her. I was like, "Oh, hey, what brought you in today? What's your motivation?" She's like, "Oh, I'm starting up the training cycle again. Get ready for a couple races this year." I was like, "Great, that's cool. Like what races?" And she goes, "Well, I took third in this race last year, so I want to win it today, or win it this year." I was like, "Awesome. Like, what was the race?" And she goes, "World Championships for track cycling." And I was like, "Oh, okay. This is not what I was expecting at all." It was definitely not a person who I thought would look like a track cyclist, or any of that matter. It turns out it was Kim Geist, and she went on. She won a world championship that year, and I'm not taking any credit for it at all. It was shell shocking to realize, like, sometimes you don't know who you're talking to or working with, and what a body's capable of, and the numbers that she was able to put out in that test, it blew my mind. So that's one kind of cool, fun story that it was one of my first exposures, I guess, to an elite athlete. Second one is I guess more of a personal story, and it goes right into that timeline of that rush nature from ETSU to Penn to here. So to make that timeline work, I had to skip going to families for Christmas, over Christmas break. And so I had to work pretty diligently in writing to ensure I met my timeline to be able to present and defend. And I believe it could have been Christmas Eve, and I was in at the lab, and Doc and Meg were there. I think we're probably the only people in the building, and Dr. Mizuguchi as well. And they mentioned something like, oh, like, you're going to go see your family tomorrow or something, whatever it was. I was like, oh, no, like, I'm buckling down, getting the stud, putting my axe to the grindstone. And Doc looked at me and goes, no. It's like, what do you mean, no? Like, you're here on Christmas Eve reading research. Like, this is just a thing we do. He's like, no, you're coming over tomorrow. And I was like, he goes, no, I'm not taking no for an answer. And so he insisted. So Doc, Meg, and Doc's mom, actually, they took me to North Carolina, out to a really fancy brunch and somewhere out in Nashville. And it just had a really good time to reflect and kind of, realize that, like, this was more of a family setting and not just school and not just academics. And we went back to their house. We watched Bull Durham. First time I'd ever seen that baseball movie. Little to know I'd be in baseball 3 weeks later. And it was a really touching moment that it pulled me back and made me realize, like, there's a ton of times where you got to put your nose down and get to work. And there's also times in which your team and your supervisors can be like family. And the more that it is, it means a lot. You take a lot more from them as a whole. So it's a story I'll always be thankful for. But the bigger story, I think, that was really cool was I was able to present at the University of South Carolina Sprint, Jumps, and Hurdles Clinic, which was advertised as I can't remember exactly what it is, but every presenter there had coached multiple Olympic medals. And so Vince Anderson was there, Boogie Johnson was there, Dr. DeWeese was supposed to be there. Due to some other circumstances, he wasn't able to make it. And so leading up to this, there was kind of like some joking hints of like, hey, like, maybe you'll give the presentation. Maybe you, and I was like, oh yeah, like, maybe. Like, I knew a lot about the concepts and what it was, but it came down to, like, the day before we were at it, he was presenting the next day. And he finally sent me a text, hey, I'm not going to go, so I'm going to see if you can present. And all of a sudden, like, everything went off in my head. I pulled up the slides, started going through them, making sure I knew everything that was on them and I could present it well. And I felt confident in everything. And it was a bit of a scramble. And I'll thank Thomas Mislinski and Noah Army, who were both there with me to watch the conference as a whole. But yeah, we stayed up throughout the night. But the way that ended up happening was we're at the social at the end of the night, just kind of enjoying ourselves. And we weren't going to stay very long because I need to go back and review. And it wasn't confirmed yet or not if I was actually giving it. It was just a potential. So I wanted to be really prepared. And Coach D, who I think was leading the conversation or the whole clinic, came up to us, asked us if we were having a good time, yada, yada, yada. And Thomas quickly goes, oh yeah, this guy, he's a little nervous. She's like, why? He goes, he might be presenting for Deweese tomorrow. She goes, oh, like, you could present Deweese's stuff? Like, he said he wasn't coming. And I was like, yeah, like, he said he was talking to you guys. I'm not really sure of the whole scenario. He goes, no, that's great. If you're confident, we'll go for it. Like, it'll be awesome, yada, yada, yada. And so the whole morning, I was, a bit nervous, but I'm really excited because it was something I really liked to talk about. And so I got up, and I think a couple presentations had gone late. Got up and started to go through the presentation. I felt really good. The words were coming out smoothly. Concepts looked great. Interaction with the crowd was going really well. And I got to what was my time limit? And I was trying to be polite of all of that. I looked over. I was like, we good? Curtis goes, you're doing great. Curtis Fry, director, I believe, of track and field. You're doing great. Just keep on going. And so I finished it all out and had a really nice conversation with Ralph Mann and Vince Anderson after. Just a lot of respect from them. And, it was one of those moments that made me feel like I really knew what I was doing. Two, that I was really trusted by my supervisors, which was kind of a moment of aha. And three, that I was able to deliver in a unexpected circumstance almost and be appreciated by experts of a field that I was not truly an expert in.
Big time players make big time plays.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And then going back to your second story, there's definitely been a theme of some of the stories that I've heard on my podcast. I think it'll be episode 91, where whenever athletes come back, and this is kind of just a tangent, but whenever athletes come back, or they're just reflecting with their strength coach or their, practitioner in performance, whatever, is
Yeah.
it's never about the maxes or what
Yeah.
numbers they hit or getting that PR they set or whatever. It's always about those like early mornings in the weight room, or whenever they were all dancing around, or just like
Yeah.
all of those things that like we're all there. It's kind of funny. We're all there to, get bigger, faster, stronger, perform better. But like at the end of the day, that's not what you talk about. Those aren't the memories that kind of stick out in your mind. So I can only imagine kind of just how much that did mean to you, and like
Yeah.
kind of just that moment where it's like, I was going to be here on Christmas,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's just a testament to the Stones, and everyone else kind of involved with that story. And I've only heard the best of things about the Stones. And if I do decide to get my PhD, we'll see.
Yeah.
There's a pretty good case for ETSU, but so just another story about where it is about the numbers, but it's not about the numbers.
Yeah.
Kind of just your own experience, and a cool story. And then going on to the presentation. Did you coach a track team at ETSU?
So I worked with women's cross country, but purely as a strength coach. Most of my experience in what you could say would be track and field would be working with runners, but I primarily worked with like half marathon, or triathletes who would do Ironmans and stuff like that. So like, some of our triathletes would do 5Ks and stuff. So that was most of it. But in the aspect of being a track and field coach, most of my experience was under Dr. DeWeese with his bobsled athletes.
As part of the PhD, do you guys go over kind of how to create presentations, how to deliver them, like public speaking? Is that part of it, or do you guys just let your brains do the talking?
We don't, there wasn't an innate course in which like this is how you do it, but there's plenty of opportunities in which you get practice at doing it, and feedback from professors, but also a lot more so like from your peers. I think like at least the group I was in my class was pretty self-driven and really was oddly actually very close. We were told in our first year, so every class moves together as a whole. There's not like people going off in random bits. And our class, when we first kind of got together, like glued to each other. And so we were very like cared about ourselves and cared about each other. So we were always open to give feedback and always, asking for feedback and like, hey, how'd that go? Like I said, Kaylor Holzer was probably one of my best friends through the whole program. We were roommates as well with Henry Lang, and we worked together through pretty much every project we had. So like we had a really, really good feedback system of like, hey, that sucked. Like you really messed that one up, bud. Or like, hey, you crushed it. Like that was great. So as a strict coursework, no, there's not something there, but the power of the class that you work with, I think is really where you learn a lot from and push yourself together.
Awesome. So next big question, what is the story most fundamental to now? So basically without X, you would not be here.
Yeah. So I told the break story at the bike shop. That's honestly, it fuels probably every decision I have, and it might make me a bit of a conservative coach in some regards. But it also, I think, makes me seem quite the opposite in others, because I'm so confident in what I'm going to do that I'm okay with taking that risk and risk management and risk assessment. But without a doubt, it's the whole experience of ETSU. But if I had to try to narrow it down to a 3-month story, it was a summer with Dr. DeWeese and all of our other coaches, like I said, John Weigel, Alex Wetmore, Matt Sands, Austin Smith, and we had a bunch more. And the progression of gaining trust initially and what that step-by-step process looked like to becoming, DeWeese's right-hand man with our Olympic training set athletes. So there was a whole summer, and it started off just before the semester ended. Dr. DeWeese and Weigel were working with one of our NFL athletes. And I just walked out of class, and, a bunch of my classmates had walked right past this training session, and I kind of looked over to Weigel, and I went over and said, hey, can I watch? And he's like, yeah, just, don't get in our way pretty much, but you're more than welcome to watch, ask questions after, whatever. And so I did. Watched, great session. heard some really cool coaching cues, some things I hadn't seen before. Just the interaction between a coach and athlete that I hadn't seen before with both Deweese and Waggle and this athlete, and I was hooked. It was just something I hadn't seen before, and I really liked how it went. And so for a month, I went, had a notebook, stood, watched. That's all I did. I look back and I really laugh at this, but there's one day I think that Weigel asked me to record, I think it was rest, just record the time of rest to let us know when 2 minutes was up. And I couldn't tell you how nervous I was to record rest time for this athlete, something I'd done a bajillion times before, but I was so appreciative of the scenario and to be involved that I just really wanted to crush it. And so I did that. Then I became the rest timing guy. And then I became the work time guy, or the get the prowler guy, or this guy, or whatever it was. And it's not that we had a guy for these things. It just, there were responsibilities that I started to accumulate over time. That all led into me becoming pretty well, I think, trusted and allowed to do some coaching and work with some of the athletes. And that summer in particular, we had about 15 athletes that were either Olympic hopeful, NFL, bobsled skeleton, or luge athletes. And it was amazing what happened that year, because not only we had all those different sports, but we also had Canadian athletes, we had Japanese athletes that didn't speak very great English. We had multiple different personalities. We had multiple different personality coaches, all under the umbrella still of Dr. Deweese. So there was a singular plan. But the way that we were able to make those training sessions happen, which were all typically 2-a-days at 2 different locations, where we had to take a lot of our equipment to the track. We don't have a track at ETSU that we would use a lot, so we need to go to a local high school. And so to see the coordination, the planning, the processing from the very top all the way down, and then not only that, but how the goals of the day were passed down. And lastly, the integration of sports science. And I think this is really what changed my mind of what's possible in a real world of sports science. So like I said, we had 15 athletes, and we would do weekly jump tests of 0 and 20 kilograms static and counter movement. We would do isometric mid-thigh pull, a larger spectrum of jumps, and ultrasound measurements of the vastus lateralis. I believe we did that every block. Every single sprint that occurred for 3 months had a time recorded, had whatever weight was used for the modality that we're using. And then to see how all that was, 1, scheduled into the process, 2, how the athletes were kind of, I don't want to say coached or tricked into like embracing it, but how the verbiage or the message was different for different athletes to get them to be all right with integrating these practices into their training, and that it wasn't taking away from it, it was feeding it. And then I had one big last point to that, and I can't remember what it was. How the data was then cleaned and organized, and the importance of it. I don't think there's definitely a time in which we didn't do a great job at organizing and getting the data right in the right spots, and it makes things a headache. And it was a good lesson to figure out how to redo that. And the last thing I didn't mention that we did daily readiness questionnaires that Matt Sams they set up a brilliant automated script through R, and it was emailed to us every morning. There's email to the athletes every morning, email to us every morning, had a beautiful report. And just to see how the process as a whole worked, to see how all that was integrated, but then also to see how we were confirming that Dr. Deweese's plan from day one worked all the way throughout, and that when there was maybe an unpredicted response, how you would change it quickly to get it back on course. And to see how every one of those things lined up. So like to see that this type of training did this to power, this to strength, this to muscle architecture, and had this response day to day on daily readiness, but then how he was able to manage fatigue and ensure that we're ready and fresh for the next week of training. To see it as a whole, like it's in textbooks and you hear about it, but like I experienced it and saw it, and it changed everything, and it really fueled my confidence of like, if we do this, it's doing this. Like 99% sure, like this is going to roughly happen, and then if it's not this exactly, it's going to be right here, and I'm okay with that room of error.
And what's crazy about kind of like just that whole story is, imagine if you were walking out of class that one day and you're just like, oh, I'm kind of hungry, or like,
Yeah.
I just want to like just go take like a quick power nap, you know? And
Yeah.
like, and there's just so much to be said about just like being available and just like being useful and just like, you know, staying out of the way, or just whatever it may be. And there's been a few other stories on this podcast about just like crushing where you're at, you know? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, you can't work for the Cubs if you can't get the ETSU cross country team. And then you can't get the ETSU cross country team if you can't just like crush your first class of your PhD. And then if you can't crush the junior flyers, if you can't crush that high school diving team that you coached, you know, and
Yeah.
it's like people get so caught up in like wanting not necessarily just the logos, but like the logos and the pro athletes and all this kind of stuff. And like just myself where I'm at, it's like, if I can't make, you know, my 9-year-olds like want to be there,
Yeah.
how am I gonna, you know, and my 9-year-olds that are stressed because their library card is expired, you know?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, how are you gonna deal with these $1 million contracts with these family issues and and all this stuff, you know? And it's like there's this like this consistency of stories about like crushing where you're at, and you get more and more, you get rest times, work times, and then you just like help actually coach and and kind of how it all goes. So it's work hard for the right people, be available, and be like a good person. So it's kind of crazy how that all came together. So very cool story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really incredible. It's kind of like what you're saying there. Like everything you do it, try to do 100%. There's so many times, and I was talking to Dr. Tois last night. We're talking about bikes because he's looking to get back into mountain biking. This will be really quick, but we're talking about the shop that I worked for. And before I'd worked there, the first 10 years when they dumped millions of dollars into it by getting this phys lab and all of this different stuff, they had a great coaching environment. Mechanics were all white, which if you ever worked on bikes, they're dirty and greasy and messy. And so they were all white as a kind of like a sign and indication of how clean and precise they were. And that they always reset every job. They always redid everything. And that, you know, you could have washed something and you see that one little grain of dirt. It's like, nope, I'm going to go back. I'm going to rewash the whole thing, and I'm going to make sure it is as good as I can be. And it was something I got to be really good at with bikes, and I'm still striving to do. I would say it's sports science and strength and conditioning, but you're right. Just give it a whole lot of attention and find. I don't know if John Waggle remembers this story, but I remember it was my first year kind of during these time periods. And I said to him, like, John, how do I be the next you? Like, I like what you do. I'm going to be the next you. And I don't think I am the next John Waggle, but I did get to the weight room supervisor role and gained a lot of trust. And I think by aiming for this, I got somewhere I wanted to be. So I'm super appreciative for him as well.
Very cool. So we got about 10 minutes or so left. Try to keep this under an hour.
Yeah.
So we'll touch on the story you are most proud of, and then kind of your action steps after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my whole thing is I'm going to have a couple different ones. Real quick one. When I was going through the IRB, which is the review board for all research at ETSU, I was trying to run 2 studies, which were nearly identical in every case, except one was on the bike and one was on a treadmill. And we were doing some stuff with blood flow occlusion for normalization for muscle oxidation, yada, yada, yada. Long story short, the IRB was not very happy with how I had put the request in. And so they asked for a full board hearing, which, you know, I think there's 30 or some people, full of medical doctors, and people across all sorts of different fields. And Doc got me ready and, you know, made sure I was on top of some things. And so him, myself, and Mark South, our lab supervisor, went down to this meeting, and it's about 30 of them there, and they just start rattling off questions like, hey, what's this? Hey, what's that? Hey, what's this? Hey, what's that? One doctor in particular, it was kind of funny. He goes, you know, how do you know once you've exceeded systolic blood pressure that there's occlusion? I was like, well, that's that's the definition, right? Like you go down to systolic to wait to hear blood through a stethoscope, and that means blood flow is going. So when you don't hear that, blood flow is not going. And the doctor kind of just like looked at me like, oh yeah, yeah. And, so I thought it went really well. It was a really nerve-wracking meeting, but after we walked out, and I don't know if you ever talked with Doc, but I said, Doc, like, how do you think that goes? He goes, I think you stumped him. And I was just like, it was one of those other like aha moments. Like I did something great. Like I was so well prepared and educated in this one little narrow thing that I had that, I walked into a room of doctors and it confirmed and taught them some stuff about it. And it was just one of those other like great moments that I felt great about. But I think more of a story would be was when I was with the junior flyers. That process was really interesting. So when I first joined, I was with some of the younger teams there, and there was a current strength coach who was a previous pro player who was working with the team, and he had left on paternity leave within the first couple of weeks of the season for 2 or 3 weeks. And this was probably one of my first like fears of conflict, that the manager came up to me and said, hey, I really like what you're doing. Like when he leaves for paternity leave, you're the strength coach for the rest of the season. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, should I talk to him, see what he was doing? Like see how the transition is. And she was like, he doesn't know yet. I was like, oh, okay. And so then took over the team, and it was really interesting. So I'm dealing from like, 19 to 22-year-old kids that are, this really high level of hockey. I knew hockey pretty well. I worked with our Westchester women's team for a year that did pretty well. And so I knew a lot of stuff I wanted to do, but when it came to working with the guys of hockey, I was very far into that. And I was really proud and impressed of the ability to gain buy-in from them and transition what their sessions look like, which were typical pre-workout bodybuilding, scream, oh, let's just get after it, to, we had a crude concept of a periodized season where we went from volume to power, where we had high days and low days, where we focused on recovery modalities. I actually got a lot of the team to buy in where before a big practice or before games, we did guided meditation and progressive muscle relaxation to kind of help reset themselves. I would go on the road with them and try to do as much as I could to like get them to a place. And not saying that I was the thing that changed a whole lot, but there's a lot about what we had done that they were not doing that I think that really improved performance, and it resulted in that championship. So amongst that and the hockey staff and the players themselves and the diversity of the players, like we had a goalie who was 6'8", 6'9", and like 130 pounds, 140 pounds. I forget what he was. Tiny little guy. Like it was amazing. Didn't want to lift weights, so it just wasn't his thing. He had some injuries in the past, and so like we just had all sorts of different modalities to like keep him on the ice, keep him healthy, and try to find strength where we could. And he went on to play, I think, 4 years of hockey at a collegiate level, D2, and we still keep in touch as well. And just a moment of sitting there and watching them go through things. And it's the first team that I really had like a strong connection to, and felt like I'd made a impactful difference on their athletic careers, or at least at the time I did.
Very cool. And just like the opportunity to have consistent and like just a duration of training. Like it's kind of just, if you're doing good stuff kind of over time, like I can just imagine looking back, it's just like, we got to this point in time, it's like when you first took over, it's like, if I were to tell you in like 10 months, you guys would be at this point, these guys would be doing this training, you'd be gelling this well, you'd be like, oh my gosh, that'd be amazing. So it's just a testament to like consistency and that human factor. And you use the term buy-in a lot, where it's like, yeah, we had this plan, but like it was more that I got these guys who were at this state, and then like kind of working together, collaborating with them, we got to here, and it's so facto there was a lot of wins along the way. But very cool story. So kind of last thing, so I love the theoretical and the stories and all this stuff, but at the end of the day, we are practitioners and we have to be good at what we do. So if you had 1 to 3 kind of action steps something that the listener can start doing tomorrow to start becoming better, what would you recommend?
Yeah, it's one thing, and it's resonating with me more and more for that Adam's instilling with us is plan, do, review. It's something I think I've done for a long period of time, but not as concrete as that, and not as diligent in it. So it's actually something I'm starting a little bit more of, waking up the day and I'll write down my schedule, go through the schedule, I'll check things off as I go through the day. I've never been a person for notebooks or writing things down, but it's something I'm getting a little bit more into, just to hold myself more accountable for things. And I think it kind of bleeds into this concept of if you're trying to do something actual, you're trying to make a change. And so if you're trying to make a change, it needs to have, or if you make like a promise to yourself, it needs to have proper reprimands if you don't do it, almost. And that sounds a little harsh, but I just read Atomic Habits, and one of the biggest things that I took from the book was a lot of people make goals to do things, but they fail because they either spin their wheels and they talk about doing it and they never do it. So one, do it. Two, they feel like there's not a big reprimand, so they don't feel bad about not doing it. The best example I can give on that is recently I quit drinking, and it was actually after that book. There's a bunch of other reasons, but one of the things that made it so easy was, he says, don't set a goal. That's not a time course, or I'm going to do this for a month, I'm going to do this for it. Choose the person you want to be like, and identify as that person. And so, like, once I went from, hey, I'm not going to drink for a month just because I think it's good for my health, it went to, I don't drink. And then you start telling people, hey, I don't drink. And then if they ever see you with a drinking hand, they're like, hey, what happened? Like, hey, you a liar now? Like, and so it's almost like this, you set this whole guilt into yourself and this big reprimand on yourself. And so I think plan, do, review, and hold yourself accountable with some of those things, and tell people about it, and that's really good for it. Two, I think, and I don't know how to get this. For me, I think a big part was selling things. So at bike shops, I had a massive sales background, and it was non-commissioned sales. That it was about things I was passionate about. And the beauty of sales is, to be good at it, you need to adapt, right? There's going to be 1,000 different types of people that walk into the shop. I could have a guy come in, try to buy a $10,000 bike, have a guy come in, buy a $2 tube and try to haggle. It's like, you don't treat those guys the same. And so being able to read an athlete, read the room, see what's going on, and then work on being able to say the same thing as many ways as you can in different lenses or through different scopes. And I'm going to merge 2 and 3, as I think it's, for me, I really enjoy getting an athlete proficient at lifts and stuff like that. But then I also really enjoy, with most athletes, I'm not going to say all, to get to a point with them where we can go through an entire training session without talking about the training session. And by that, I think it's really interesting, and coming from like a diving background, where between dives at a competition, you're talking with other competitors, you're mixing it up, you're whatever. It's usually a hot tub, but then your name's called in a second. You got to get in the zone to, perfect movement patterns, complete silence, and you got to go. And that might not be too dissimilar, I think, from most sports, and definitely from pitching. And so I find it really interesting and challenging to be able to have a conversation or a training session that is not revolved around training. To me, it instills that you've coached the athlete enough that they know the concepts and the cues. So it's not, like I said, it's something that happens after you have confidence in this athlete, but it also is like a progression of the skill of training in my mind, that if the athlete can come in, have a conversation, but know how to turn it back on when they need to lift the weights, then come back out of it and continue that conversation. It drives much more by a personal connection, that kind of family connection that I've talked about before. And it's a testament to how much you can coach without coaching. Like, it could come back to like having more verbal cues, or like using your face to describe things, like, hey, that wasn't good. So instead of going through a whole thing, just kind of end the squat and go like, and they know already, and then they make that fix. And so it's a process, I think, that kind of comes, I think I took from selling things and being a salesman to understand how to manipulate a scenario without actually directly coaching it. And in sales, that's, hey, like, you really want this bike, but I really think this is a better scenario for you. So like, let's try to like have this conversation, but find our way over here. And I'll further that with non-commission sales, because then you're not driven by monetary. It's truly passion and truly in the benefit of the athlete or the client at that point.
Awesome. So I'll touch on those, try to do those justice, and then we'll wrap this thing up.
Perfect.
But going on to the first one, so I'm going through this leadership thing with my mentor, and it's been super fundamental, and touching on like the phrase of the leadership thing is like, what's at stake, or like, why now, or like, what happens if you don't do it or you don't pursue it, and these are different examples, but I appreciate your openness about kind of your drinking and stuff. And I'm living at home with my roommates that I call mom and dad, and my like, what's at stake, although it's not the worst thing in the world, it's COVID and everything, but like, am I setting myself up? Like, that's the background of my phone. Am I setting myself up for ? Am I setting myself up to keep living at home, or am I setting myself up for this career as a professional and that like I want to achieve, and like similar to like, well, am I being the person that I say I want to be, or am I setting myself up to just like stay where I am, so like having that kind of end goal, and it can't be a negative, but like what happens if I don't do it? Just being like very clear, and like kind of, it's always like, oh, well, this is so awesome and it feels good to talk about, kind of spinning the wheels like you said, but it's like, well, what if I don't do it? What if it is just talk? So I think it's good to kind of take a step back and put things into perspective on really how important it is to do, by realizing what happens if you don't do it. And then the last point, on how there is value in everything if you like seek it out, and like having this non-commission bike sales job, like how important that is on how to like navigate that conversation, how to quickly understand where someone is at versus like where they say they're at, and how to like kind of guide that conversation, and how that is similar with training. So no matter where the listener is at, like there is value in what they're doing, and you have to figure out and put two and two together about how those skills can transfer and how you can kind of make them transfer. So cool. It's cool on how like it really does all come together if you like make it so very cool. So we are at the end of our podcast, and I want to say thank you for your time, and I'm opening the floor up to you, rolling out that red carpet to plug whatever you want to plug, where people can get more of you and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Instagram and Twitter. I think they're both under Dr. John Abbott XFiz or Dr. John Abbott. I can send you the links if you can attach those to this. If you're on Instagram, there's a 33% chance you're going to see something about myself lifting as a personal pride thing, bikes or food. Twitter is going to be a little bit more sports science and trying to stay healthy with networking. And I just have to thank everyone that's helped me with these stories, from Philadelphia and Caden Cycling Multisport, Mark Davino and Brady Gibney, are just really amazing guys and mentors. Corey Walton, Jeremy Weeks, they're definitely worth a follow on Twitter, or reaching out to talk to. And everyone back at ETSU, from the Doc and Meg Stone, Dr. DeWeese, and all of my colleagues, John Waggle, Alex Wetmore, Ryan Sauceman, Matt Sams, Kayla Hairholes, Russell Smith, Corey Kennedy here, just all amazing people, and all really open to talk and chat. And so they're definitely good people to try to network with.
Awesome. So those will be in the show notes. And I want to say thank you very much again. I'm looking forward to our next chat.
Absolutely. Thank you a ton, Matt. Thank you.